everybody, it's Tim and welcome to the show. You know, I don't know if I've ever been more excited to bring you a show, and we are in Paris, France, as you can see and probably hear. And this is where Jim Morrison spent the last couple months of his life back in 1971. And it's easy to see how he fell in love with this place. But those last couple months, and especially the last few days, were shrouded in mystery. And we're going to see if we can get to the bottom of some of the real and not so real and conspiracies that were included in his death. So I thought we'd start with a little backstory on the way to our first stop. And just a disclaimer, as a card-carrying ugly American who speaks only a tiny handful of French, I am prone to mispronouncing everything, so cut me a little slack, s'il vous plaît. All right, on to our first stop. In the fall of 1970, Jim Morrison was in Los Angeles awaiting an appeal for his conviction on indecency charges stemming from a Doors concert in Miami, Florida, for which he had been sentenced to 6 months in prison. And to say the least, his life was spiraling out of control. He was getting so drunk at live shows that the Doors decided to stop touring and concentrate on recording. And that's when they did their last album, The Brilliant LA Woman. Now, Jim was obviously unhappy with being perceived as nothing more than a rock and roll sex symbol and felt compelled to pursue his life as a writer and poet as his heroes had. And what better place to do it than here in the city of light, Paris. So on March 10th, 1971, the Doors had fulfilled their contract obligations with Elektra Records, and just days later released the single Lover Madly. And that's when Jim left for Paris without saying as much as a goodbye to anybody in the Doors. And I think it's fitting that he got exceedingly drunk in the airport bar at LAX and missed his flight out. He had told a friend about why he was leaving, and he said, "I don't know who I am and I don't know what I'm doing. I just want to go away." But if the Doors were breaking up, it was Jim and only Jim that knew it. The other members of the Doors and their entourage had assumed that it was just a temporary thing. Jim was going to Paris to get his head together. Jim arrived in Paris a month after Pam and joined her in the temporary living quarters she had made here at the Hotel Georges Zinc. It's now the Four Seasons Hotel, and I checked it. It goes for upwards of $2,000 a night, so as Jim called it, a plush red whorehouse. At best, Jim and Pam had a stormy on and off again relationship. He was an alcoholic philanderer, and she was a heroin addict. And I think it's important to remember that Jim was just 27 years old. He was still a kid, and like many people, he had romanticized Paris as a Paris of the late 20s full of artists and writers. But I think he didn't take into account that even in the 70s, barely anyone spoke English here in Paris. And Jim knew only a handful of words, so it became an issue for him. Hotel Zinc, Paris. Most of Jim's new acquaintances were actually friends of Pam's, including the Count, Count Jean de Bétre, hope I got that right, who was a creepy 21-year-old aristocrat who was into women, beating them up in heroin, not necessarily in that order. And he was also friends with Anita Pallenberg and Keith Richards, probably mostly because he sold them dope. So as it turns out, the Count and Pam were carrying on an affair, and it's unclear whether Jim knew about it or not, but as the weeks wore on, I don't see how he couldn't have. But the one thing that the Count and Pam did have in common was their mutual love of heroin. So I have no internet. I'm completely lost. And this fine gentleman right here is taking me to the Rue des Boutrelles. Rue Boutrelles. That's my bad English on the street. Anyways, we're coming up to it right now. So now we're in the Marais district on the right bank in Paris, and this was once the Jewish quarter, and it's adjacent to landmarks like Notre Dame and the Louvre, so it's probably a lot more hip than it was when Jim and Pam rented the sublet the third floor apartment here in 1971. At first, Jim would spend his days working on poetry and writing for a project about his observations on America while being put on trial in Miami. And he was beginning an idea for a rock opera. I'm not sure if the Doors ever gigged with The Who, but obviously Morrison thought they were onto something. And also one of Jim's idols, poet Charles Baudelaire, actually lived at 20 Rue Boutrelles right here 100 years previous. And I don't know if Jim knew that or not. But he and Pam would also frequent this restaurant called Les Boutrelles, and it's the place Jim and Pam ate at regularly, probably because of the proximity, but I'm sure the food was great. I've yet to have anything less than a great meal here in Paris. So I've been in Paris for a few days now, and the song that keeps playing on endless repeat in my head is People Are Strange. You know, faces come out of the rain when you're strange. Anyway, this place isn't far from Jim and Pam's apartment, and it's called Place des Vosges. And you can see it's a typical urban Paris park, and it's where Jim would come very often to contemplate the world. He was an observer. He didn't like being observed, and that was the whole thing about Paris for him. He could kind of fade into the woodwork right here. He did a lot of writing here on the many benches and at the bars that border the place. And he always carried a scrapbook with him to write down ideas or make sketches. If nothing else, Jim Morrison was a true artist. So now we've crossed the Seine into the left bank, virtually in the shadow of the Notre Dame Cathedral. And this is a walk Jim would have done with regularity. Some of the bars and cafes that Jim liked were in this section of town, and they were frequented by a lot of the college students that used to hang out here. And of course, it brings us to the Shakespeare and Company bookstore. Being the voracious reader he was, Jim would come here a lot, and he'd spend hour after hour perusing the endless racks of books here. I have to say that I think a fair assessment of Jim Morrison is Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And when you walk around here, you can see the gentle part of his soul, the books, the art. And on the other hand, you can see the chaotic wild man that he became. And I believe alcohol probably had a lot to do with that. Shakespeare books. On June 14th, Jim called John Densmore in LA, and John recalls that Jim sounded much happier than when he had left in April. They chatted for a short few minutes, and Jim wanted to know how the sales of LA Women were going. John, of course, told him that the album was climbing the charts and that Lover Madly was a hit, and they were preparing to release their next single, which would be Riders on the Storm. But what John Densmore didn't tell Jim was that he and Robbie and Ray were practicing new material, and that it wasn't the standard blues-based type material that Jim loved. It was much more jazz-influenced. Jim told Densmore that he'd be in Paris for a few more weeks, and he'd be coming home after that. They said their goodbyes and hung up, but it would be the last time any member of the Doors ever spoke to Jim Morrison again. Jim was once quoted about what it took to enter his inner circle, and he said, you got to get smashed to make a fool of yourself in a public place. You got to get 86 from 7 different nightclubs. And one of Jim's favorite Paris watering holes was Bar Alexandra, which is long gone. Another one was right here at Les Misettes. Jim's only requisite for a good bar was that they were tolerant of him getting super drunk and loud, and he would assure this by giving the wait staff very large tips. But as the weeks wore on, Pam was off and out with her count friends, who Jim detested, and his French was rudimentary at best, so he was always dependent on an interpreter. And I think it served to further his alcohol consumption, to deal with the isolation I'm sure he must have felt. But this was the very last place that Jim Morrison was ever seen in public, La Mazette. Jim Morrison loved the cafe scene in Paris, and he loved the Les Deux Magots restaurant here, and right up the street at the Café des Fleurs. These were among Jim and Pam's favorite hangouts, and they're the very same cafes that the likes of Hemingway and Pablo Picasso used to hang out in the 20s and 30s. So by May of '71, the alcohol and rich French food was making Jim appear bloated and overweight, and it didn't help that he chain-smoked Marlboros and suffered from violent hiccups and would sometimes cough up blood. He had asthma and a lingering pneumonia, and took some pretty heavy-duty meds for it. Not to mention, he had never fully recovered from a second-story fall he had taken in LA at the Chateau Marmont about a year earlier, when he was doing one of his famous balcony dances, and he severely and forever damaged his lung. So here at Café des Fleurs, where Jim came upon a couple American street musicians that were busking out in front here, and he decided to spontaneously bring them to a small recording studio in the area and do a stream of consciousness lyrics with them. So after an hour and a half of starts and stops and general anarchy, they threw in the towel, but the tapes somehow survived, and they surfaced in 1995 as the Lost Paris tapes, I believe they were called. But it would be the last time Jim Morrison ever recorded on tape. Right here. So now we're on Rue de Seine, not far from Café des Fleurs, and this used to be the site of the once vibrant rock club called the Rock and Roll Circus. And in the summer of '71, it was a very happening discotheque. It was back behind the gates here, and there's actually another entrance around the block, so we'll probably check that out too. By June of '71, Jim was hanging out here often into the wee hours, and usually in the company of females that were, let's just say, not Pam. He would usually get drunk to the point of passing out in the street, but the club was very tolerant. He was, after all, the frickin' Lizard King, and we'll get to more on that later. So this is finally the time to delve into that fateful last night in Jim Morrison's life. There's at least a few variant stories about what happened, but I think everyone can agree that it culminated back at his and Pam's apartment on 17 Rue Bertrelli. So we're gonna head back there after this. So the commonly held narrative is that after dinner at a Chinese restaurant and going to the movies to take in Robert Mitchum's movie Pursued, Jim and Pam returned to their apartment at about 1 a.m. Jim didn't go directly to bed, and he did something he rarely did, which was listen to a Doors record. Pam claims she went to bed but was awakened by Jim's labored breathing and coughing fits, and then him vomiting up blood. It was then that he announced he was going to take a hot bath. Pam awoke to find the bathroom door locked, which sounds a little fishy to me, and in a panic she called some friends who came over in a rush and broke down the bathroom door. They found him lying face up in the bath dead, and it's reported that he had a small smile on his face, but who knows. So we're back at the Rue Bertrelli apartment, and by 9 a.m. that morning, the authorities had arrived. Pam Corson claimed to have been so distraught that she couldn't clearly recall much, but she had conveniently found the wherewithal to flush her stash down the toilet and burn some of the notes and letters that Jim had written. The coroner estimated the time of death to be about 5 a.m., and the cause was heart failure, and I'm guessing it was helped along by the heavy-duty asthma medicine and copious amounts of alcohol he had consumed earlier. You know, it's been reported that Jim's body lay in the bathtub, packed in ice and wrapped in plastic, for 72 hours before the casket came to take him to Père Lachaise Cemetery. And by the way, there was never an autopsy performed on Jim Morrison. More on that later. So if you haven't guessed it already, this is Père Lachaise, and it's the cemetery where Jim's grave is. And he loved it here, and as a matter of fact, had visited the graves of Oscar Wilde, Balzac, and Edith Piaf less than a week before he died. And I've heard it's the fourth most visited landmark in Paris, which may or may not be true, but it proves rock ain't dead yet. The circumstances of Jim's death and what happened at the apartment are suspect at best, and there have been several alternative conspiracy theories that have popped up. A couple that I think are somewhat plausible, two in particular which I think have merit. And the first hypothesizes that Jim had snorted Pam's heroin thinking it was cocaine and OD'd in the apartment. So the whole bathtub thing was just a ruse to cover up Pam's complicity. The second one's more involved, but I think it's extremely plausible, and it went like this. In an effort to renew his relationship with Pam Corson, Jim had taken to doing heroin, and Jim Morrison never did anything halfway. Now, Paris at the time was the center of the European heroin trade. Just watch the movie The French Connection. And its purity and strength here were second to none. And as the rumor goes, on the night of his death at 2 a.m. at the Rock and Roll Circus, he copped from two of the Count's dealers. And Jim was found 20 minutes later in a toilet stall there where he had died of an overdose. So to avoid implicating the Count, not to mention not getting the Rock and Roll Circus closed down because the Lizard King had just OD'd in the toilet there, the two men brought Jim's body back to his apartment and threw him in a hot bath. And this would explain why the coroner fixed Jim's death at 5 a.m. because his body temperature was still elevated from the hot bath. And it would somewhat explain why the powers that be were so adamant about getting his body into the ground as soon as possible without an autopsy. You know, all conspiracies aside, the funeral was conducted just 4 days after his death with just 5 mourners, including a 21-year-old manager of the Doors, Bill Siddons. On July 4th, the news started breaking, and to say the least, the music world was in total shock, if not disbelief. And the rumors persist to this day that Jim Morrison had faked his own death. And Ray Manzarek maintains that no one ever saw the body, including manager Bill Siddons. And to the day of his death, he believed that possibly Jim Morrison had faked his death. So the postscript on Jim's death went like this. The Count died of a heroin overdose within months of Jim, and Pam Corson died of an overdose in her LA apartment just 3 years later. And by the way, she was 27 years old at the time. Jim's last words were written in one of his spiral notebooks titled Paris Journal. It went simply, last words out. Jim Morrison, 27 years old. So that's going to wrap it up for us. And I got to say, this has been the greatest road trip ever to the greatest city ever, Paris, France. And I can see why Morrison fell in love with it. Très magnifique. Anyways, if you like classic rock, please check out the link below. We've got a lot of videos that I think you'll dig. And if you wouldn't mind liking and subscribing, if you haven't done it already, I'd appreciate that too. For Tim, peace out. Let's be kind to one another. Au revoir.